One of our panelists is driving up from Seattle and is a little bit late, so we're hoping that we'll still be able to enjoy her talk tonight. I'd like to welcome all of you to the 11th Annual Education Law and Social Justice Forum. The forum is sponsored by the Journal of Educational Controversy and the Center for Education, Equity, and Diversity. And this year it's also co-sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union of Washington and the Student ACLU Club as well, and supported by the Western Washington University Diversity Fund. My name is Lorraine Casperson. I'm the editor of the Journal of Educational Controversy. And I just want to introduce my colleague who is in the back there. If you could wave, Kristen. Kristen French. Kristen, of course, is the director of the Center of SEED. I'd like to remind you that we will have a question and answer session at the end, and I'd like to encourage a discussion. You know, usually at events like this we have people just asking questions, but I really would like to encourage all of you to engage in a discussion. We're interested in what your views are as well, and what we have in our audience today are folks from all kinds of different perspectives. Some of you come from human services, some from teacher education, some from, there you go, some from others, all others. And so what we'd like to do is have an opportunity to come and share ideas and bring our perspective to the discussion of a very vital issue. We started these forums some 11 years ago now, and we were trying to find a public space where the university community and the community here in Whatcom County could come together and talk about the deeper issues, deeper educational issues that emerge from a democratic, pluralistic society. And in the last 3 years, we decided to use the themes of the Journal of Educational Controversy as the topics for our forums, so that you'll be able to hear some of the thoughts coming out of our authors. Come on over. There's a seat here, a seat there. You can use the seat in the front. I want to make sure everybody's comfortable. That's what part of being a teacher is. You got to always check your classroom and make everybody comfortable. So we're inviting our authors to come and share some of their thoughts with you at these forums. We also started a video series called Talking with the Authors, and these are hour-long interviews that are web streamed into the journal, and I invite you to take a look at some of those. We have excerpts now up on YouTube as well, and we also have a blog so that you can enter into the discussion. It's all part of our aim to get this discussion and this conversation going between educational professionals and the general public. Our current issue of the journal is devoted to the topic of poverty. The theme is actually the hidden dimensions of poverty, rethinking poverty and education. And it's now online, but when it was actually planned, it was long before these recent economic crisis sort of hit the headlines of the media. And in some ways, the current conversations about today's events, today's economy, mask the enduring problems of poverty that have long plagued this nation that was committed to equality and social justice. And so the aim of our issue was to step back and examine the multifaceted dimensions of poverty and to raise some questions about the mindset that is too often perpetuated about those who experience it. As a philosopher in a college of education, which has as its aim a very vocational aim to prepare teachers and human service providers, one of the goals that I have as a philosopher is to make people aware that the way they think about a concept, the way they think about things like poverty, will determine how they address it and how they go about teaching it. And so what we want to do is to look at how teachers, human service providers, other educational practitioners conceptualize poverty and how those ways of thinking affect their work and their relationships with those that they serve. Many of the authors in this issue of the journal are particularly critical of the kinds of workshops offered to teachers and human service providers that simplify both the problems and our understanding of the lives of those living in poverty. Some of you may have taken those workshops. Some of you who may be teachers in the audience had your district pay for some of those workshops. And we find that a lot of those workshops really simplify things and distort things and distort our real understanding of what it means to experience poverty. Tonight, we're going to try to rethink the issues surrounding poverty and education. And we have three panelists, hopefully, who come from three very different perspectives. I think what we'll start with is John Korsmo. John is a faculty member in the Human Services Department here at Woodring College. And he's going to examine the issue from his perspective, coming from human services and from social and community work. John's article is in our current issue is entitled "Poverty and Class: Discussing the Undiscussable," and I invite you to read his article. Excellent article. In it, John describes a project called the Community Engagement Research Project, and I notice that some of the people involved in that project are here in the audience. Maybe we can hear from them at some point. His project stresses authentic dialogue and relationship building with members of the community who are struggling to overcome poverty. And John reminds us in a quote that I love in his paper. He says, quote, "There is no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the silenced and the deliberately misheard." End quote. And then we'll turn to Darcy Lees, sitting next to John. Darcy is a civil rights consultant. She's a member of the Washington State Multiethnic think tank. And she's going to talk from a multiple perspective, from the perspective of teacher education, from her experience as a teacher herself, as a high school counselor, and her work on equity issues at OSPI. Darcy coordinated the Low Socioeconomic think tank, which is part of the Multiethnic think tank here in Washington State. And they issued a report that we published in the second issue of our journal. That report is now under revision, and we will be publishing the revised report in the journal in the future. Darcy has provided a summary of her report, and we inserted it. Well, I think we handed it out along with the program that you received. Darcy also has some sign-up sheets, and if you are interested in becoming part of the Washington State Multi-Ethnic think tank, we'd like you to sign up. There are 5 think tanks actually. There's the African American think tank, the Asian American think tank, the Hispanic American think tank and the Native American think tank. And Darcy was the one who coordinated a special think tank devoted just to looking at the issues of students from poverty, from low socioeconomic status. Now, obviously, it's related to all of the others, but it's interesting that that we have a way of targeting just the group and their unique problems, and Darcy has been able to do that, and she'll talk about that whole experience with you. Finally, we have Rose Spidell. Is Rose here yet? Not yet. She's still on the road from Seattle. Rose is actually she is a staff attorney for the ACLU in Washington State, and Rose is going to talk about the topic school to prison pipeline. Too often in our society, it is the children that are marginalized in our society that get channeled into the juvenile justice system rather than into our colleges. And Rose has worked on a 2-year project that addressed issues of educational equity in school discipline proceedings and in truancy proceedings, with a focus on the impact of those proceedings on Native American youth and their families. And as Rose writes, the ACLU is trying to reverse that pipeline and trying to educate youth and families about their rights, trying to affect changes in policy at the district and state level, and trying to litigate on students' behalf when necessary. So that will be a very important perspective for us to look at. Well, you have biographies of each of the speakers in your program, so I'll let you read more about them on your own. Let me welcome our 2 panelists. And John wants to start with a PowerPoint presentation. So John, I'm going to have you describe what you're going to do, and Darcy and I will go in the audience and watch the PowerPoint.
Thanks, Lynn. So I'm glad that we are talking about this in a setting that's steeped under social justice, because it's in my frank, candid, and individual opinion, if you're not a steward and a champion of social justice and human rights, you oughtn't be an educator, you oughtn't be a human services professional. So for us to be talking about the issue of poverty, disproportionality, and the way that we interact together as a whole, absolutely must be steeped in that notion of social justice and human rights. So I want to thank Lorraine and the rest of the crew for inviting me to be here. So I also like this quote from Arundhati Roy in particular, because that's what we are oftentimes doing. However, I want to sort of make it a little bit more personal. And for some of the folks in the audience, you might remember, it's actually been a little over 20 years since Robert Fulgham's pinnacle work. That all I needed to learn, I learned in kindergarten. Well, I think all I need to learn, I'm now learning from my kindergartner. And this is her, this is Sophia. And about 4 months ago, or so, of course it was right on the holiday time, we're driving, and we're talking about, they're about to have a food drive at school. And she was talking about it with some interest and enthusiasm. And so, of course, me being the teacher dad, I'm like prodding a little bit. So what is a food drive? What do you talk to me about? What is that? And then she's like, oh, Dad, it's when we bring in food for poor people. And so I've said something to the nature of, oh, honey, I'm really glad that we're able to, give some food, take some food to the school and everything, but I'd really appreciate if we didn't refer to folks who might be in need of some extra food as poor people. And she and I have had similar conversations about this before. We're always checking each other on our vernacular. But I look back in the back, and she's a little bit upset, and she's actually she has tears in her face, and she's actually a little pissy with her dad at this point. And she says, but Dad, I don't know their names. Of course, he's going to refer to them as poor people. That's what she was told that they were. They were poor people. That's why we're going to give them food, because they need, and we are going to do unto them to save and protect and help them. In her world, though, she didn't have their names. She didn't know the context. She didn't know anything about their personal life. And so I want to start off with the wisdom that I can learn from a 5-year-old who is talking about reaching out and actually understanding who people are, who we're working with. So here we go. In a lot of the work that we do, we're often talking about professional boundaries, and I'm absolutely a fan of professional boundaries. But oftentimes we talk about not letting it get personal. When we're talking about issues of socioeconomic status and class and race, what's more personal than that? It is absolutely personal. And for us to approach it from a non-personal perspective only distances us from the people who we're talking about instead of talking with. That's why I'm so glad that we're talking with each other tonight, even though you're going to hear from a couple of us more so than we'll hear from you. That's really what this is about, is talking together. And in terms of, and that's part of what the article is about, is engagement. Cross-cultural, cross-class, cross-disciplinary discussions, bringing people together to the table who wouldn't normally get together. Similar to what we have here, cross-section of folks. And it's the notion of getting personal. So imagine for a moment all of these great numbers that we hear of in terms of the poverty rates, and I'll skim through some of those. And the reality is we can just become numb to the numbers that get sort of drawn into us. Some people even actually get sort of complacent with it and feel like, well, today, in 2009, we really don't need to deal with this stuff, at least not here. There are other things to deal with. But after a decade of decline, the proportion of folks living in poverty is certainly on the rise. And all of the current statistics that I or anyone else is talking to you about do not take into account the current economic crisis. We just can't yet. We can only make forecasts that it's going to get worse before it gets better. But the reality is that since 2000, the number of poor Americans has grown by nearly 6 million people. Now, a lot of folks, and I mentioned this in the article, a lot of folks want to blame the people for their economic status in life. It's a choice. Robert Rector is a good example of somebody from another think tank. It's a think tank that I think might have a hole in the tank, but it's a think tank, who is talking about the notion that people are strictly to blame for their own lot in life. And he actually lists 3 different categories of people who are bringing those numbers so high up. And it's immigrants, predominantly immigrants from Mexico, who he's blaming, single, unwed mothers, who he is blaming, and people who are just generally having children out of wedlock. So if we could just get the women to marry their men, the problem would be solved. And if we could get those immigrants to leave, the problem would be solved, erased from the paper. It's an opinion. It's one worth having a discussion about. And in fact, we need to have the discussions because there are a lot of folks who are having that similar opinion as that. Now, looking at this number, then 6 million people have made that choice to become poor since 2000. It's a tough choice to make, especially considering that we're still measuring poverty rates on an archaic system. And I'm not going to get into all of this too much. It wasn't intended to be a lecture, but really a discussion. I do want to point out, though, that this is the current federal poverty line. And so in order to even be considered in a lot of the statistics that you are hearing about, this is what income level you would need to make to be able to fit the mold. Certainly a lot of organizations are rightfully making adjustments to their own service requirements, that people don't have to fit this mold, but they can make 150% of the poverty line, or 200%, or some are even getting as high as 300% of the poverty line. But to consider that we, in the arguably the wealthiest country in the world, that we have over 37 million people living in poverty at those rates is appalling to me. And it's sort of ridiculous to me that we would have this. And so to be able to get to a point where it's personal and not just a number, I think we all have to be able to put some personal touch to the fact that we have so many folks around us who are struggling. So let me put it into context for you. And some of my students have seen this slide, so bear with me here for a few minutes. I want to show us sort of a visual of what 37.3 million people would look like on a geographic map. And so what I'm going to give you here are just some general population goals. These are not people living in poverty. This is total population. Okay, so and they're roughly 6.5 million people living in Washington, almost 4 in Oregon, and so on. And you can see where I'm going with this. In order for us to get a picture of what indeed does 37 million people look like, because that's a number that we can easily say, we can say it many times, and it isn't going to have the impact of the reality of being able to put a face or a place with it. Just to strike it home a little bit more, the purpose of this discussion, that element of our grand nation would qualify as that number that we're talking about, that big number that we're talking about. That's still not even at the grand scheme of things. So we could throw Alaska into the mix and we'd still not be at the number of people in this country who are living below the federal poverty line, at or below that number. Again, it's appalling and it's unacceptable. And if we think about poverty from a human rights and social justice perspective, who can be justified in that? I certainly can't. And I would guess that none of the folks in this room would be willing to go there either. And yet we keep on going. And I want to just put a reality check on things. And I know I'm not Pollyanna, and the folks who know me personally they would testify to that. I don't see life through rose-colored glasses. I am a realist. And yet I also have a vision and an idea for better. And I know it's going to happen. I know it is better now than it once was. However, the reality for me is that I can hear, and I would bet that the same with all of us in this room, I can hear of thousands of people who are suffering around the world and hear these numbers. I can hear 37.3 million people living in poverty and think, oh man, it must really suck for them. I'm running late for school, I better put my shoes on and go. Almost that modestly concerned with it. But I tell you, if we make it personal, then there is something to be said for that. If these two people were suffering and hurt, I guarantee you I would not stop until something was done about it. It means happened to my 2 children. Once we know, or at least open up the possibility of knowing, at least the acknowledgement that we may know somebody who is among the many who is suffering, then it becomes personal. And I can't just say, oh damn, I better get to school. I have to say, oh man, I've got to do something about this. I think that we must make this personal. It is a personal issue. So real quickly, the disproportionality factor, because we're also talking about race in this discussion, is something that we have to focus on as well. Absolutely, there are some myths about poverty in this country that we need to sort of challenge, and there are some realities that we need to be faced with and deal with. The disproportionate numbers of minority population who are in poverty bracket is one of those categories of distinction that I think really needs to be dealt with. So when we have 12% of white U.S. citizens living in poverty, 20% Hispanic, and 32% of African American citizens living in poverty, according to 2007 data. And we know that those populations, by tracks of where people are employed based on demographics, we happen to know that the places where those folks are employed are the places that are being the most hit at this point in our economic crisis. We can only imagine what's going to happen to that disproportionate number. It's not going to tighten up. I absolutely don't want to have more white people in poverty to even out the playing field. Absolutely committed to making sure that we deal with the fact that racism is well and alive in this country when we're talking about this stuff. Again, what I talked about in the article is oftentimes poverty, like race, like sex and sexuality and sexual orientation, is a don't go there sort of status. Once we talk about it, then we might be so inclined to actually do something about it. I want us to open up the opportunity, the chain of communication, so we can go there. Real quickly, because there's a lot of educators in the room, let's think about, for a moment, addressing the achievement gap, so it's cut off at the top. But in terms of the achievement gap, you can see here that white and Asian students are much more likely to excel in the WASL, if we're going to give any credence at all to the WASL. And they're going to test at roughly, let's see, what is it, about 25% higher than their Hispanic and African American counterparts are in math. About 24% higher in science, 16% higher in reading, and 15% higher in writing. So, again, it's not surprising that we are allowing this sort of disparity to happen, and then it matches pretty well across poverty lines. Not surprising to many of us. And then again, so now when we look at just the socioeconomic status, or the SES, of folks taking the test, you can see here that it ranges from 18 to 24% of a difference. Now we're in reading, we're talking about roughly almost 30% of the difference in math, and almost 30% of the difference in science based on socioeconomic status. Those are real. I'm not going to get hung up on the statistics and the numbers, because that's not as personal as I'd like it to be, but I think we have to be able to support our intentions with a knowledge base that reminds us of where things are in terms of a benchmark. So now we can go back from a reality check to say, years from now, what does it look like? What kind of progress are we making as a society around education, around the way that we work with people, not to mention keeping people out of the prison pipeline that will be talked about later on. So again, just a challenge, if not debunk some of the myths. A lot of folks feel like the minority population make up the bulk of the poverty population. That's not true yet, and fortunately not. Although they're disproportionately numbered in terms of poverty rates, there are still more white kids in poverty than there are children of color. And a lot of folks don't go there. They want to, oftentimes, I'm sorry to be so sardonic about the whole thing and cynical about it, but I think oftentimes we want to other the others to the extent that we don't have to go there. It makes it very easy for me to just focus on putting my shoes on and getting to school, and not focus on helping those two cute, little, adorable, sweetest children you've ever seen in your life that I showed you about 10 slides ago. If people don't, if I'm not connected to them, then what the heck? Why would I be as concerned with them? It makes logical sense. So now real quickly, I want to ground this in some local stuff, and this is where I get to talk a little bit, very briefly, about some of the work that I'm currently doing. So several years ago, there were a lot of organizations locally in Montgomery County, predominantly human service organizations, but a cross-section of sectors, including business, including government, including education and healthcare, that came together in Montgomery County because everybody, it was this amazing moment of synergy where in different pockets of the community people were talking about, man, we've got to do something about this. And everybody went, whether it was in business or whether it was in retail and faith groups and churches, or if it was here on campus, people were saying, we've got to do something about this. Understandably so, because the numbers are going the wrong direction. So Whatcom County has a higher, it had been and it has now, a higher rate of poverty than the Washington state average, which had a higher rate than the national average. So we have a problem to deal with. So a lot of people came together and said, oh, yeah, let's do something about this problem. So about 50 people initially came together, and there are at least a couple of those people in the room now. And we came together and we talked about how we might approach this issue. Make a long story short, we ultimately did a two-pronged sort of focus, basically a community needs and gaps assessment. I was fortunate enough to be on the qualitative team, so I led up the qualitative side of the research. Someone named Greg Winter led up the quantitative side of things. And Greg is now the director of the Whatcom County Homeless Services Center, and is doing great work around dealing with issues around homelessness under the umbrella of the Opportunity Council. There was a whole slew of us who were working together around this stuff. Through our work, there was a theme that kept coming up, and that was relationships, relationships, relationships. On the qualitative side of things, we had over 100 informants, meaning we talked to about 100 people, predominantly people who were currently dealing with issues involving poverty, but also talking to people who would not fit that category, even folks of wealth, of great wealth, who are major philanthropists in the county. Across the board, relationships came out, and the stories that we heard were amazing. Not surprising, but amazing. From that effort came a volunteer group of myself and Deb. Governor Deb, can you raise your hand? Just wait for folks. Deb was one of the folks who volunteered, and this was a couple of years ago now, and we're still together as a group. But we started a community engagement group, and from that group we just got together. We were a bunch of people who cared about the issues. Several of us personally experiencing poverty in the moment right now, whether it was dealing with homelessness, the inability to feed themselves and their family or get health care or what have you. Across the board, we all had an interest. Some people were living it today. Others of us lived it in years past. Now, from that group, though, we have managed to formulate relationships that have lasted, and they have actually made a difference. Our engagement has made a difference for the people in the group, whether it's through friendships that happen that would never have happened any other way, or whether it's through the tangible stuff like the securing of a contract from the state DSHS office and actually creating a position called community navigators that's really looking at an alternative method of case management that puts lay people in the position of case managers, and they're not taught from the textbook style of being far removed from the people in terms of trying to work with them, but rather to embrace and engage with the people and work with them at the ground level opposed to at this academic level. That's about all I'm going to say. If you want to hear the end, you have to read the story. Actually, the way that I end the article is to say that that particular group, the community engagement group, is a model that I'm actually touting when folks ask me what kinds of things are working well. And in fact, there's a proposal into the National Institute of Health right now through written a grant for a nice chunk of money to come to Whatcom County for research around how about the health disparity and the health access for people living in poverty, and using the community engagement model as the model, the approach that we're going to take. Taking a lay person's approach to actually getting together with people to communicate with them at that personal level. Again, when I think about that 37.3 million figure, it's easy for me to go to sleep at night. When I put my children or my friends or my loved ones or any of you in this room into that mix, it makes it a little bit harder for me to sleep without doing something about it. And as an educator, it is my obligation to talk about this stuff. If I'm not talking about it, I am doing a disservice to the folks in the room who I'm learning from and who are learning from each other. So I'm going to stick around for your questions after a bit. Invite the other panelists back up to the stage.
Hey, thank you, John. One of the questions I think we might want to get into during our Q&A session is what is John's work with the community? How does it relate to teachers' work in the schools? And can we find some ways of developing synergy and work together? But we'll hold off until we hear our other panelists first. I see our third panelist is here, Rose Spidell, and Rose, I already introduced you as the ACLU staff attorney who's going to talk about the school-to-prison pipeline. Okay, so secondly, we're going to hear from Darcy Lees, who's going to give a kind of a personal account of how she formed the think tank that tries to call attention to the lives of children who are living in poverty. So, Darcy?
My son, he was in this performance group, and they said you're supposed to hold the microphone like an ice cream cone. So if I grab hold, you'll understand. Okay. Thank you, Lorraine, for allowing me to speak tonight, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. I feel kind of tied to education as my son's a senior this year at WSU, and that's good. But on the other hand, it's not such a great time to be graduating from college with the job market. My husband also is a library media specialist in the school district in Auburn, and the layoffs come May 15th. So who knows what the situation might be. And I guess I wish the best for all of us because it's not always a great time. One of the things that I talked about at some of the recent think tank meetings was that the students who are in poverty that we've had in our schools, the face of some of those students may be changing, and students who are used to having things may not be having things. And so it's opening up a broader spectrum of how we interact with kids. My comments today will be to tell the story of the low socioeconomic think tank. The ending first, and then how we got there, because I think one of the things that we've learned about sometimes students live in poverty, they tell the end and then they go back and tell the whole story. So pardon me for that little bit of licensure. And also, I'm going to have a few little bird walks along the way, because that's also the way that we know that sometimes students in poverty function. But as we look at education and the needs of students living in low socioeconomic homes, it is critical to understand the history of education's response to them. One of the responses of educational leaders at the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction was the creation of the low socioeconomic think tank. About 12 years ago, OSPI created what's known as the Multiethnic think tanks, and as Lorraine said, it's known as the MET. This was a result of the school reform passed by Congress in the early 1990s and of the Senate House Bill 1290 passed by the Washington State Legislature. And as you know, the Washington State Legislature resulted in a statewide testing program, as our previous speaker talked about, known as the Washington Assessment of Student Learning, or the WASL. One of the things in his chart, he showed that percentage of students who lived in poverty based on WASL data. One of the things to know about that is that it's based on free and reduced lunch. So it doesn't include all of the students who are living in poverty. And one of the things that we know is by the time kids get into high school, they don't choose to take free and reduced lunches. So the number is probably greater than what we can assume is reflected in the data shown. Anyway, due to some of the equity supervisors, of which I was one, the test items were reviewed for bias. So we knew that as we looked at ACT, SAT, there was a history of bias in testing. And we wanted to, and from the training that some of us had, we wanted to try to assure that the WASL items themselves were unbiased. The committee was sometimes overridden by the test writers on certain items, and sometimes we neglected to see some of them, like the one that said Mary Kay, the correct answer was Mary Kay Letourneau. And you guys didn't laugh at that, did you? Anyway, that may show my age. Anyway, she was a woman who'd gotten in trouble in education, and so whoever that test writer was really smart and had set up an item so it said that, and it went by everybody until it got out on the test, and one of the kids figured it out. So even the best efforts doesn't always guarantee something doesn't get past those particular individuals. Also, we put pressure on the agency to disaggregate by race, gender, and economic status the test results. As a result, OSPI learned that the students of color and students from low-income families had less success on the WASL. I think that some of the criticism of the test is an enigma, because was the test biased even after the item review, as some students still did poorly? Or were some groups of students receiving a less equal and poor quality education The answer in my mind is probably some of both. But that is another story and soon to be put to rest discussion as it's related to the WASL. As a result of the findings on the WASL student populations, equity staff at OSPI and other consulted educators decided to create the think tanks to look back into educational research on students of color. Educators of students of color and many educators who were of color were brought together and formed 4 think tanks, which Lorraine alluded to before: the Hispanic American, African American, Asian Pacific Islander American, and the Native American. As the data from the test was reviewed, some, including myself, questioned that just addressing race would not close the learning gap. Although students of color, and this was mentioned previously too, perform lower at proportionally higher rates, the number of white students performed low. A higher number, of white students performed low. That caused by the larger number of white students overall in the system at the time. I emphasize at this time and this time because that will change. Thus was created the LSE think tank, which defined its mission as not as a white think tank, but as a multiracial group based on low economics. At about the time we began to look at low socioeconomics in education, little had been written regarding this subject. Most was anecdotal and experience-based. My knowledge, too, fell into this category. As an example, my experience was coming to Wenatchee from Arkansas as a baby in 1948. For those of you too young to remember, most of you in this room, I assume, the early migrant workers on the West Coast were Arkies and Okies from the South, sometimes known as poor white trash. After graduating from high school and college, I taught math in a recently desegregated junior high school in Arkansas for 1 year, and then a culturally deprived, that's what we called poverty then, school district in the foothills of the Ozarks for 1 year. Back in Washington, after completing my master's, I was a high school counselor for 15 years before working in equity and civil rights at the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction for 18 years. At that time, just before going to OSPI, dropout education was the focus of federal funds being sent to local school districts. Later, those funds were refocused on drug and alcohol education. Where are those funds focused now? I think maybe some back on dropout education. Note that funds prior to that time had a social service model thing. When we got into drug and alcohol, it was more about protecting middle class students from involvement in drug and alcohol. So the shift of the funds is something to always be watchful for. Personal experience. So from my personal experience, being poor, teaching poor students, counseling dropouts and poor students, there's that word poor you were talking about, and helping individuals and families, often poor or low socioeconomic means, get their rights is often the base from which I view the world and respond. One of the few authors at the time of our first draft of the LSE think tank who addressed socioeconomics in its relationship was Ruby Payne. Now, Ruby Payne fascinates educators because educators are often looking for a quick fix. And Ruby was an educator who was writing about an issue teachers knew they had and was a way to respond. I classify her writing as anecdotal and experiential from her perspective. Justifiably, there has been criticism, but as I read her work, I saw relation in my experience, the way I interacted and reacted in my life, and some of the students and families with whom I worked. Perhaps because it became more acceptable to discuss social economics rather than race, and due to controversy her books and papers caused, more research has been conducted and more books and papers written with this focus, which is what needed to happen. The LSE think tank paper is in its third update. As a work in progress, the paper is now being reviewed by a sociologist. You can review the paper as on the Journal of Educational Research website here at Western Washington University. So it will be, or it is, okay. The paper, as the expected handout indicates, is intended to be a practical tool giving students, parents, educational staff, communities to-dos. So if you look at the paper that you were given, you'll see one side is basically to-dos. The section that I picked out is kind of the introductory, or the kind of the overall section of the paper. As you look at the rest of them, you'll notice that when you get an opportunity, that they deal with the student learning objectives. And so, not student learning objectives, where am I at? Aligned with the reform goals in addressing the needs of LSE students. So this is the first of about 5 sections that follows this similar format. And so we wanted to try to help give parents, the community, everybody, the colleges, to understand their role in helping to address low socioeconomic students. As it states in the paper is intended to invoke the reader to critically examine personal images, visions, thoughts, notions, perceptions that come to mind when hearing the words free and reduced lunch, economically disadvantaged, poor, welfare, homeless, reservation, immigrant, migrant, English language learner, Latino, Latina, Native American, Asian Pacific Islanders, and so forth. When students and families are cataloged such terms, we may be unconscious of our own programming and experiential, behavioral, and research facts or myths that come to mind. The think tank welcomes your suggestions and contributions. And as Lorraine said, there is a sign-up paper out there that you're welcome to, if you'd like to be involved in the think tanks. It is educators, community individuals, both of color and white, that have come together to try to address the needs of students from low socioeconomic means. Each think tank takes a turn hosting the meetings, and individual think tanks may meet between the larger group meeting. Being independent from OSPI, it probably about 3 years ago, it became independent from the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. That was, at first, it was difficult because the individuals had been used to kind of a guiding hand and someone to call the meetings. And so they had to take over responsibility for themselves, which is what you hope people do when you establish an organization. The advantage was that the Met could work on legislation. You're tied to SPI. Unless SPI wants to present the legislation, it's difficult to do. And much as in other organizations of color or low socioeconomics can't always get their voice heard in a larger organization. Let me say that I'm retired, so that's why I can say some of the things that I'm saying to you. At any rate, it was good, and the legislature passed a bill that asked the 4 think tanks of color to develop diversity plans to address the needs of their students. For the low socioeconomic think tank students, there is not an identifiable constituency to advocate on their behalf. So the challenge I have to leave with you is who will speak for the low socioeconomic students? There is one group called the Children's Alliance. That's a possibility. You can find them online as well. Or maybe you can help speak for the low socioeconomic think tank students. Thank you.
Okay, Rose, you wanted to show the clip first?
Yeah, we can show a short clip. That
Okay.
would be great. And I have
The school-to-prison pipeline is a reflection of America's current fixation with punishing children rather than educating them. It means that so many children who go to our schools to get an education end up in the criminal justice system, finding themselves charged with all sorts of offenses that some should not even be criminal. And so instead of a school to college, it's a school to incarceration, to punishment, to prison.
Courtney was an A and B average student. until she started having problems with the school system here?
When I first received my first in-school suspension, I was 14 years old. You don't receive regular lessons like lessons would be when a teacher's in front of you teaching you. It's them just bringing you papers that's been printed off and they hand it to you. Or you just write out the encyclopedia all day. It's just you in a box to yourself, writing all day. You can't stop writing.
She had already started talking about just completely dropping out of school.
Coming from an AB student to an F student to failing in 9th grade, it has really put a huge bond on me because I really want to pass so I can get out of school so I can achieve my goals in life that I have planned for myself.
Thank you. So that's just a really brief introduction to one part of the school to prison pipeline, which is something that we talk about. It's something that the ACLU National and the ACLU of Washington and other affiliates are working on around the country. It's what we refer to when we talk about policies and practices in our public schools, primarily also private schools, that push school children around the nation, especially the most at-risk students, out of classrooms and into the juvenile and criminal justice systems. It reflects a prioritization of criminalization over education, and it falls heaviest on the backs, or should I say the futures, of children from minority communities. And this clip shows you a perspective that was put together by ACLU National. I want to start by going through a few scenarios from actual families that we've talked with in Washington State about how they are affected by policies and practices in our public schools in Washington State that serve to push kids away from school, away from a graduation date, and away from a lot of chances and opportunities that we all take for granted, I think, in life. Before I get started, if you're comfortable, if you would just raise your hands, how many in this room have graduated from high school? So I have a sense that those that raise your hand understand the value of that and where that will allow you to go in life. Without that graduation, your prospects for jobs, for a lot of other things in life become a lot more difficult. The education that our state provides is not something that we provide out of generosity of our heart. It's written into our Washington State Constitution that it is the paramount duty of our state government. The paramount duty, that first duty of our state government, is to provide an education for all the children in our state. Unfortunately, we're failing in that, and when a lot of students are being denied the right to an education through various policies and practices, in a way that I think we need to reflect on and see if it's where we want to go in the future. So let me say a few practices that we've focused on as the ACLU of Washington, trying to figure out where are these points where kids are being pushed out of the system. As a civil rights organization, we're concerned about it from a racial justice end, and we're concerned about it from a sense of due process. Is there a fair analysis of what happened and what the appropriate response is when kids are being pushed out and effectively denied an education? So we look at truancy. What happens to kids in Washington State when they miss school without a valid excuse? We look at school discipline. For what reasons are students disciplined and excluded from school, from the classroom, from the school entirely? And we look at the role of police in schools. When I was in school, and I used to think that I was not so dated, the police came to school for the DARE classes. Now police are there every day, and they're in the hallways, and they're involved in what would have been school disciplinary matters handled by the principal. So let me start with an example from a sort of rural urban school district in Washington State. There was a student who called us. He had been suspended for possession of drugs. He was given a 45-day suspension. It was his first offense, but drug possession is considered an extreme violation of the rules at the district, so his first offense was 45-day suspension. Now just calculate in your head how many days of classroom time this student is missing and how he's going to catch up afterwards. The background of this suspension is that the student is from an immigrant family. His English is fluent, which is great, but his parents are still learning English, so they have been unable to advocate for him in the process. So he actually makes the call to us and asks for help and says, what are my rights? He attends a school that's predominantly white still. He is a black student. He denied ever possessing or using drugs, and in fact, the day that they alleged that he possessed them, they searched him for drugs. Twice. They came up empty. Twice. They nonetheless took the word of another student and said, you're suspended. They told him on the day that he was suspended, he had to go home and could not come back to school until the suspension was over. In fact, that's not true. When a student is subjected to long-term suspension in Washington State, they have a right to a hearing before the suspension is imposed, which means the school is supposed to tell him, we think you did this and you violated our rule. We want to suspend you for 45 days. You have 3 days to decide whether you want to exercise your right to a hearing on that. If within 3 days you don't decide that you want a hearing, we get to impose the suspension, and at that time you have to leave school grounds and you can't come back till the end of the suspension unless you get readmitted otherwise. If you ask for a hearing, we can't impose the suspension until after the hearing. He didn't know that, and so he left school grounds and he sought help. He asked for information about how to ask for a hearing. He eventually got a hearing. It was about a month later. At the hearing, he convinced the hearing officer that he should be able to go back to school right away, and he convinced the hearing officer that they should now give him his homework for those days that he missed so that he could catch up from 30 days. So that's the scenario. We know that schools have rules against drugs and they need to be able to enforce them. They're reasonable. We know that they use suspensions, but that's one way that a kid, fortunately who's now back in school, is trying to catch up, was really at risk of being pushed out. He missed 30 days of school. He took it on his own accord to try to get the education he needed, the homework that he needed to catch up for those 30 days. So here's another example from a relatively rural school district out in eastern Washington. We got a call from a family with a student, another young man, was expelled on an emergency basis, emergency expulsion, for gang activity. He was accused of gang membership based on photos that were discovered on a friend's MySpace page that had been taken 1 year prior to the emergency expulsion and posted at some unknown date, but discovered that day. They were alleged gang association photographs where they showed kids holding up peace signs and wearing bandanas. So he was emergency expelled. Now, under the laws of the state, emergency expulsions are supposed to be limited to where there is an imminent threat to the safety of the school or other students. This was not an emergency, but nonetheless that was imposed. His mother, I think, surprised the school and immediately asked for a hearing. It took several days for them to get the hearing on. At the hearing, he was successful in getting it reduced to a 16-day long-term suspension and eventually went back. But there's a little bit more background on that. The student who was expelled is Latino. His family moved to the area. They've been there for a while, but they moved into a town where the Latino population, the community, is growing really rapidly. But it's relatively a new thing. So you can see the student population, the changing demographics of the student population is happening very fast. The changes in demographics of the teachers and administrators and people who make decisions in the school community is changing slowly. So it's also true that there's some differences and divisions and misunderstandings and miscommunications with these cultural differences. So a person who's not familiar with a culture, and we hear this all around the state and around the country, misidentifies cultural expression as gang expression. And we don't mean to minimize the fact that there are real gangs out there, and there's gang activity and it's criminal activity, but when we allege that someone's in a gang or gang involved, we have to be careful about who we're saying that about and what we mean that to be. This student actually, his mother is a corrections officer. She receives regular training on gang symbols and what it means to be in a gang and how dangerous it is. And I'll tell you, she would brook no dissent from her son when she says, you are not going to be in a gang. Right? So she watches what kind of bandanas he carries. She watches what kind of things he wears to show or indicate or not whether or not he's in a gang. So they were really troubled by this allegation of gang affiliation. Nonetheless, in order to get him back into school, because he really just wanted to be able to catch up and get to graduation, to go back, he agreed to sign again a gang contract, which prohibits him from writing anything, saying anything, talking about anything, making any gestures that the school administration might think is affiliated with a gang. That's a problem, right? Because some gangs identify by number. So I don't know how you finish your math assignment when there's the 13 and the 18 gang. These are things we can joke about. Unfortunately for this student, it means that he's under constant threat of another expulsion, another disruption of his school life, because there's a misconception and a mislabeling of him as a gang member. So he's living under that. Back in school again, it's a nice success story. But again, it sort of shows that when our schools are making decisions about who to expel, who to deny the right to an education, we have to be really careful about whether it's making the right decision and whether that's the appropriate response. So those are both about discipline. The truancy system in Washington State has been a particular focus of mine in the couple years past, and the ACLU Washington and other groups are focusing on it because we think it's fundamentally flawed. Basically, and you all may be fairly familiar with this, if you miss a certain number of days of school that are not deemed excusable absences by your school district, which will define its own definition of excusable absences, and which could include an accumulation of tardies to certain classes, then you can be referred to juvenile court. Once you're referred to juvenile court, the court can issue an order which basically says, go to school, have no more unexcused absences, and don't get in trouble in terms of suspension. If you violate my order that says go to school, I can sanction you for what we call contempt of court. And those sanctions might include community service. They might include time in juvenile detention, which reads jail. The other thing that you can get for being absent in Washington State schools is you can be suspended or expelled. You can be kicked out of school for missing school. One of the side pieces of this process in truancy court that we just started learning about as we investigated it was illustrated by a report that we heard from another family. There was a student who had been referred to truancy court for missing school, and he went back to school. His attendance was on and off. One time at school, the police came and arrested him because they had a warrant that was issued by a judge when the student had failed to appear for a hearing set in the truancy case. Remember, this is the case that's intended to help make sure the kid gets back in school. So he's arrested on the warrant. He's taken and held in jail until the next court date, which, if that's Friday that you're picked up, it's Monday. The student had missed the hearing. This was a case that a colleague of mine worked on because he didn't drive. He didn't have public transportation options to the court, and he was temporarily homeless. He was moving from his family's house to a close relative's home and back, and there was no reliable transportation. And yet, he was picked up, arrested while at school for missing a truancy court hearing. He had an advocate. I don't have the end of that story right now to share with you. Just one more story to sort of put another perspective on the way these things play out. We got a call from a family where a child was expelled for fighting. Actually, this child had gotten into fights repeatedly, and the school said, look, next time we're going to have to expel you. You can't fight in school. So after the last warning, he got in another fight, and he was expelled. So he had multiple chances, he had warnings. Ultimately, they imposed sort of the most harsh punishment. Well, the history of this student matters again. So the student is African American, and each time he got in a fight, it was because someone was calling him the N-word. And he really didn't appreciate that. And his response was, which his parents tried to counsel him on, was violent reaction. He would respond by fighting to them. Well, he and his parents were making progress in trying to help him understand that he could respond differently. They were also trying to work with the school to say, look, it's not appropriate that our son has to hear this word. It's one of the most offensive racial slurs, and our son is trying to go to school and get an education, and this is harassment. Well, ultimately, the N-word didn't stop, but the student was expelled. His option from the school is an alternative school. It offers 3 days a week of school, and it's a 30-minute drive away, and there's no public transportation there. So the family is now working on other options, right? Because you go from 5 days to 3 days of school a week, that doesn't help you move towards academic success or graduation. It probably doesn't help you resolve issues about how to deal with your peers even when you are being harassed. And the school district still has the issue of a racially hostile environment potentially in the school with racial slurs being flung around like that. So these are some real examples of the school-to-prison pipeline currently at play in Washington State public schools. When we look at the statistics about the differences in African American, Native American, Latino student success on the WASL, can we really be surprised that they're not doing as well on tests if they've been excluded from school at much higher rates and for much longer periods of time? We don't have all the data and statistics to put that together because actually Washington State schools are sort of hit or miss on collection of discipline data and truancy data and whatnot. But we really think there's a common sense connection between the amount of time that you're excluded from your classroom, that you're effectively denied an education, and your ability to succeed academically. There's also a connection to your ability to succeed and whether the educational programming and the atmosphere in school is equitable, whether it's fair, whether it's free from discrimination. I can't imagine what it's like to try to go to school and be successful and be engaged and be discriminated against at the same time on a daily basis called racial slurs. I haven't had to experience that, so I don't know what it's like. But I know that students struggle with that, and I can imagine that it's very difficult. So that sort of paints a picture that I think is a little bit gloomy. I'm happy to say that there are some success stories in there, and I think that they happen, one, when people who are being affected are aware that they do have rights in the situation. So one of the things that the ACLU of Washington has tried to do is develop materials that can be shared with the community, that can be shared with families and students that talk about what their rights are. Because, I don't mean to malign educators or the administrators in these systems. They are working under systems that have been built up over time, right? When you start saying that a 20-day suspension is appropriate for one thing, but then this is more serious, so we have to ratchet it up. So then if we don't suspend you for 45 days, how are we going to say that drugs are bad, right? You need to have sort of a counterpoint on the other side, and the way to have that counterpoint is when people know of their rights to be heard. They know of their rights to challenge the proposed disciplinary action that the school has put forth. So we have developed a number of guides, sort of a general know your rights for students, lets you know your rights about free speech, about being free from discrimination, about your right to see your own school records, about your right to have privacy in those records, just a number of things. We have a guide on school discipline, specifically what are your rights to hearings, what is your right to due process, the fairness, to be sure that there's a factual basis that you actually violated a rule. Even if you violated a rule, you can challenge the punishment. Let's say you violated the rule they do have a rule against gang apparel, and they've identified something that is in fact gang apparel, and you violate that rule. What is the appropriate punishment for that violation? You can disagree about that, and you have a right to be heard. So we have a booklet on that. We have a booklet on truancy and one on school board representation, advocating in front of a school board. Because some of the changes in terms of combating or dismantling, as we say, the school-to-prison pipeline happen in individual cases. They happen as a student steps up and says, it's not okay for you to suspend me for 45 days on an allegation that's not true, and by the way, during the term of the suspension, it's not okay to completely deprive me of any educational programming. In this state, we have a right to an education, and I need something to keep me going towards graduation. So it's individual cases. It's also addressing these issues on a policy level. So on the truancy issue, for example, we've talked with a number of Native American tribal communities are working on truancy issues. Sometimes government-to-government relationships, the school district and the tribal government will be working out, as you're defining what you're going to excuse as an absence and not excuse, please don't consider just the traditional religious holidays that we all think about, Easter, winter holidays, whatever. Think also about the cultural celebrations that are absolutely essential in our communities, our tribal communities, when you're going to decide whether to excuse or not an absence. I haven't talked a lot about police in schools, but we have worked also with communities to try to change policies and set up procedures so that before a student is interrogated by a police officer at school for a potential rule violation that also could turn into a charge in the juvenile court, that the parents ought to be called and ought to be there, so that a 12-year-old is not in a closed room with an SRO, a school resource officer, who's a police officer working in the schools, with the dean of students and with the principal being told that he needs to confess because things are going to go easier that way, and that they'll call his parents once he's told the truth. We've heard things like that happening and worked with parents and communities to change the policy so that they would call the parents first, so that the student could have someone there to turn to and advocate with them. So I think, we've talked about poverty, and, we certainly can't deny that that is one of the elements at play here. The thing that's unfortunate, and I think that we do need to come to terms with, and is, I think, sometimes an even riskier or more challenging issue to get people to acknowledge and recognize, is that it is still about race and ethnicity and racial differences and assumptions. It's not all explained by poverty. And so we do have work to do in terms of making sure that our schools are equitable, making sure that when teaching and administrative professionals are confronted with these issues, that they have the tools to deal with them. That means in the programs where you're learning to be a teacher, in the continuing professional development, that you get the skills and the tools to deal with this so that discipline becomes really a part of the educational process and not a way to exclude students from the educational process unless it's absolutely necessary. So that students can be in school in a place where it's not a racially hostile environment, so that educators know how to create that place. We all know that teenagers are going through all kinds of hormonal issues. Teenagers are going to do and say things that are inappropriate, and you have to know how, in an educational setting, to stop those when they cross the line and to create an environment where everyone is welcome and everyone gets the kind of educational programming that they need to succeed. The one piece that I haven't mentioned yet, but really is showing up all around the country and true too in Washington State, is that students with disabilities are particularly hit hard by these things. So you see often if a student has what we call an individualized education plan, in other words, they've been recognized and evaluated as a student with a disability, they've set up a plan to respond to and appropriately accommodate that disability. If that plan is not working, you often see that resulting in disciplinary action, or the student misses school and they end up in truancy court. Those are things that shouldn't happen, because we should be trying to figure out and make sure that your disability is being appropriately accommodated, you're getting the right educational services that you're entitled to begin with. So I want to wrap it up there. I just want to say the school to prison pipeline, unfortunately, that's what we've, it's been termed that. It does exist in Washington State. There are efforts underway to correct it. It's never a quick fix. I think it involves sort of a shift in thinking. Are students who misbehave a threat to the educational process, or are they students who could benefit from further education through the disciplinary process? When we're dealing with students who are missing school, can we look to the background of that? Why are they missing school? Is it really going to correct it if we give them time in jail? Is time spent in jail going to all of a sudden cure whatever issues were going on that prompted this student to miss school. So those are some of the things we're working on. I'll be really glad to take questions, and like I said, I have some handouts that sort of describe the issue and some of the pieces of work that are going on around it.
We want to be able to hear your questions, so take the mic and raise any questions you want. And as I said, let's try to get a conversation going, discussion going, and feel free to follow up on your questions. Feel free to elaborate on it. So let's open it up to our audience.
I don't need a microphone.
Okay. So this question is for John Korsmo. The programs that you participated in, the community program, you got in touch with a lot of people and learned a lot of stuff, right? But then what? That's what I got confused about. After that, how did that help? What did that do? What did you do to... I just missed that part of it.
That's where the fairy dust came in. And we sprinkled around the room. A lot of conversations. And what happened was, when we were doing the qualitative study, part of what we talked to people about was, if we do something else, would you like to be engaged in this? And we did keep track of who said yes and who didn't. And when we decided, well, so many people wanted to build relationships, why don't we just cast a net out and see if anybody shows up? So we basically just opened it up, invited people who expressed an interest to have such an engaging discussion. And lo and behold, about a dozen people showed up. That number went down over time, and then it grew over time. And the same the group of people kept coming. And it sort of condensed to about 3 or 4 consistent people who then identified other people who they thought would be interested in being engaged. And Deb is sitting right behind you, and she would be able to speak to her level of engagement in terms of what drew. Deb, why did you show up, and what's kept you showing up for nearly 3 years now? Yeah.
You guys have all night? We initially, the engagement group, what I started out with was the Prosperity Project, and John and folks gathered information about people in poverty and their personal stories. And one of the things that kept me going after the Prosperity Summit was the fact that it was the relationship. It was the relationships with folks that wouldn't have talked to me just on the street because of my economic level, my background. I come from a poverty background. When John spoke about choosing poverty, there isn't anybody that I know that chooses poverty. Situations happen. What keeps me engaged in that program is that the work that we do is engaging other people that have never thought outside the box, that can find people that have situations happen to them that perpetuates poverty. Oh gosh, there's so many things, you guys. Let me say this. One of the main things that happens in our engagement group was the Community Navigator program, and I am a Community Navigator. And we don't approach the Community Navigator program as clinical, like we work with the SHS and folks that are in sanction. I go out in the community to their homes. I go out at night. I go out on the weekends. I go right to where the source is. We build a relationship. We find out why they're not engaging, why they're not being successful. And the only way you can do that is to have people trust you build that relationship with them. They actually tell you what the problem is, and you're able to help them access the necessary programs, the necessary folks in the community to help them move forward. In our state, there was 4 community navigator programs last year. Whatcom County led in being successful, and the success rate with people being able to move forward and out of poverty. And it is relational. People are afraid of the caseworkers. They're afraid of telling what's really going on for fear that their situations will be worse. And what happens is when they get to know you and trust that what you're there for is actually to help them, and you're actually interested in them as people, and see, you don't classify them as poverty, you see them as people with needs. And you're able to build that relationship and connect them to other people that they build a relationship with and they trust. And people start thinking other than just right here, right now, how am I going to feed these kids? How are we going to get food tomorrow? A lot of the people that I deal with are homeless with children. You know, I don't know what today's statistic is, but the last statistic I heard in Whatcom County, we have 1,200 families, not the mentally ill, not the drug-related, not the alcohol, but families that are homeless, that are living in cars, on the street, in tents, you know, trying to make it. And part of what our program does is help those people get into housing, help them, you know, give them hope and direction, and we advocate for them through the system, and we hook them up with other advocators where we are seeing people move ahead towards education, to being self-sufficient, to having places to house their families.
Thanks, Sue.
Was that too much?
I would like to just follow up on a point you made. I'll just follow up on a point you made about homelessness. Rose, what are the legal rights of children who perhaps go from one shelter to another who are homeless on the street? Maybe you could elaborate on that.
I know some about that. It's not my focus, and there are some great advocates for homeless youth at Columbia Legal Services. It's another legal organization in the state. But there is a federal law. It's called the McKinney-Vento Act. It gives money to states, and it requires them to do certain things. It requires them to identify students and their families who are homeless, because generally people don't walk up and say, hey, I'm homeless, I'm entitled to all these rights. So it does require an active effort to identify students and families who are experiencing homelessness. And homelessness is defined not only as living under a bridge or in a car, but it's also living temporarily with other family members or moving between places. Once you've identified who's homeless, there are certain rights for those students. Some of the big ones are your right to remain in your district of origin. So let's say you're homeless, but you're having to live temporarily with a family member that's in another school district, or if you're in a large district in a place where you would end up at another school. The school has to work with you to keep you in the same place if that's what's best for you, so that you have continuity, because that really matters. If it needs it, they have to provide transportation for you to keep getting there, whatever form that may take. They also have to make some exceptions, allow you to enroll before providing the various documents that you might otherwise need. So, for example, they have to enroll you immediately and then later get the things that they could otherwise ask for, immunization records, etc. Because when you're homeless, it's harder to keep all those things intact and be able to show that immediately. Also, they're supposed to take efforts to make sure that you can succeed just as any other student. And so it's a little more vague and less exactly defined than the transportation issues. But the school should be making efforts to make sure that as a homeless youth, that you're not disadvantaged, that you're still able to engage in sports, extracurricular activities to the extent that you can. Keep up in academics. that you can have a full life at school, because that may be the most stable place for you when you are at home in a homelessness situation. So there are rights. They are the one what I'm aware of is the federal law that imposes obligations on schools, and so advocating for your rights, there's not necessarily a real clear, like you can go to court immediately, but there are some processes to go through hearings and resolve disputes between a family and a school. Each school district is required by this law to have a liaison, a specific person who is dedicated and charged with the duty of working with, identifying and working with homeless youth and families. So if you're in a community, if you're working at all with schools and you want to help the homeless student youth population, find out who that liaison is. Make sure that they're engaged. If they have any questions or you have questions, there is a person at the OSPI, Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, who is charged with that. And then again, I would say, think about if you have continuing issues, the Columbia Legal Services, there are some folks there who work on these issues more extensively than I do.
There's also a fund that's available to school districts called the HAAS Fund, H-A-A-S. It provides funds for students who have special needs, not special needs as far as abilities, but have, need funding for athletics or activities or some, shoes or things like that. So usually the counselors or the principals are aware of that particular fund.
I guess just as a follow-up, how often do you see schools suspend students when they denied claims, such as the boy who was accused of bringing drugs to school and they didn't find any, they searched him twice? Does that happen a lot, where they just don't believe the student, yet they have no proof? Yeah.
I get the impression that it happens fairly often, and we say no proof, and I agree no proof, but the school heard from someone that someone had drugs, right? And I have to tell you, we have within the ACLU of Washington, we have a drug law reform project, and they've been working on a number of issues. They haven't specifically focused in on schools yet, but one thing that we see really common is that it really is these drug offenses that get them ratchet, right? 45 days, 20 days initial suspension. There seems to be this reaction that if we don't give you a harsh suspension, if we hear the smallest rumor that you have drugs, then there's no way for us to communicate to our student body that we think drugs are an unhealthy choice. I think there's another answer to that. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Bong Hits for Jesus case. It came up in the First Amendment context in terms of what are the rights of free speech of students, but the U.S. Supreme Court carved out an exception, an additional exception to student free speech rights, saying that you don't have the right to engage in speech that arguably advocates for the use of illegal drugs. They thought it was that serious, and similarly, for random searches without any individualized suspension, the U.S. Supreme Court, now importantly Washington State Supreme Court, said we have greater protection here, but the U.S. Supreme Court said you can search students for drugs through a urine test without any individualized suspicion that the student you're searching had any involvement with drugs, right? Those are the drug test cases. In Washington State, we just recently had a victory. The ACLU represented some families for years. We came out with a victory from our state Supreme Court that said, no, our students have greater privacy than that. You have to believe that, have some suspicion that this student was engaged in drugs to do a urine test, to make them pee in a cup in front of someone for you. I think that's a victory, but those cases, I think, are a reflection of what has become a really reactive approach to drugs in schools and any suspicion that a student might be involved, and it really appears to be taking the approach of exclusion. So I think especially in those cases we are hearing more and more. You're out.
Thanks. And then I just had one more question after that. Do schools view things like ibuprofen and aspirin in Washington State as harshly as they would? Because when I was in high school, I was in Virginia, and we had zero tolerance, and that extended to over-the-counter pain relievers. So I was wondering, how does that work here?
I've heard that that's true here. I haven't had a particular case come before me with that or intake, but what has been true across the nation has popped up to be true in Washington to a large degree.
Yeah, and I have heard of where somebody had Tylenol or something like that and has been sent home from school. So yes, I think, remember what I said about that about the time I started SPI, which was probably about, I don't know, 20 years ago. We were working on dropout education, and it was a real sociologist model of how we were dealing with issues for students who might get in trouble, drop out of school, probably be low socioeconomic. And then we went, and all those funds were shifted then to a protective model because the middle class was being affected by drug and alcohol, and we went into this almost a different thing. Eventually the drug and alcohol scene, as far as the school's response to it, did go to a no tolerance policy in a lot of districts. And I think that's what's caused the cases that you're dealing with, is that whole issue of no tolerance. And so hopefully we're coming out. I always think, as I started in education, there's this kind of thing that happens over time, and hopefully we're coming out a little bit of the kind of police state or that kind of thing, and trying to take a look at some of the root causes of why kids drop out or how they affect the system. But it was really a punishment, kind of a crime punishment model that we eventually ended up in, I think.
This question's for Darcy too. As a high school counselor, how much power or influence did you have to help out like kids in poverty and education?
Oh, that's a good question. I look at those cases, of not a lot, but some. The problem that we ran into was that I was listening to this and I'm thinking of like the kids that she were talking about coming back into school, or we would get kids coming out of the juvenile system, the rehab system. They would come back into the council and then they'd be sent to me to talk to and try to facilitate their coming back into the system. And I can remember my words often was, you've got to be twice as good if you want to survive in this system as you were before you got. What I meant by twice as good is you couldn't draw attention to yourself. You couldn't be late to class. It was almost an impossible scenario. The other scenario that they would get into is that they couldn't, they'd start running, the only people that would accept them in a group were the same kids that they were running with before. So it's really hard once you get started down the road to break out of that system. And although I wasn't always supposed to when I was working in high school, there were kids I said, I think you should go over to the community college and get a GED because you will have better success doing that, and then you can get on with your life. Because that student, for example, was one of the older students and had been asked, that they'd sent him to me because he was really smart. They'd talk in class and he would always answer all the questions, but he never did any homework. Well, he was a kid who didn't have to do homework. And so, he was going to get in trouble in class because he wasn't producing anything. And so, for him, the appropriate, in my mind, response was, at that time, based on what the system was probably to go to the community college and get that GED, and then whatever he was interested in to go into. There was also the young woman who was lived in a family where drugs were very extensive, and she would come and teachers would start to get on her case because she wasn't doing any work, because her situation was a survival situation. She would come to my office and kind of hang out. Well, one day she called me and she said, "Mrs. Lees, will you come pick me up at home? Because I don't think it's safe to be here." And I said, doing what I wasn't supposed to do, I said, "I won't come to your home, but if you'll walk to the street, I will come and pick you up and bring you to school." So there were lots of those kids. Those are just a couple of examples. But as a teacher, too, when I worked in the South, and I was the math department in a junior high school in that culturally deprived school district, and at that time, the Title I programs were just for elementary school kids, and I had junior high kids, and I had some kids who couldn't add at all, hardly. And so I made a deal with them. That's what we call accommodation. That if they would go to the Title I teacher, and I'd gone to her and I said, will you work with these kids, because they're not going to survive in my class, but they need some help. And if they do so much, then I'll pass them at least through basic general math, and we'll move them on a little bit. And so in those kind of situations, you have to, it's not just the counselor, it's also the teacher. What is the accommodation? What can I do to help these kids be successful? And that's kind of where your program is at, is listening to them and trying to figure out. As I look back over my career, the two things that I think that I did, or my strengths, I suppose, over those years, was listening and figuring out what was going on, and then being a connector. How do I connect them to some program that will make them be successful? And I guess the woman that spoke before from your program, that's what I kind of heard her saying as well.
Let's be real clear, though, it's not a program. What I'm referring to is a group of people who care about each other, and we come together to, and this is not calling a program, but we want to call everything a program, and we want to formalize them, we want to make rules, and they're always arbitrary and made up and contrived. And what we've tried to do is eliminate as many of those as possible. There will never be a rule in the group that says I can't go to someone's house and pick them up. And if there is, I'll break it in.
So this is a question for John. In your teaching, are you using these relational issues to demonstrate how to do like good social work? Because kind of where I'm coming from, I was a social worker for years and years, and if you work for the state, for example, you're taught to have a very definite line of professionalism. That's what they want to hide behind, in my opinion. So I'm wondering if that teaching in human services has changed, and if it's teaching more of that model, or if that is your sort of take on it.
It's definitely my take on it, and I would have to ask my students if that comes across around the class. I hope it does. It's my intent is to put the people first, and their circumstances are sort of secondary issues around that, but the individual is first. And within the construct of being professional, we do have standards as a profession, and I do respect that. Even though I come across as being, no holds barred kind of guy, but within the constructs of our professional boundaries, although I'll push those boundaries to their absolute breaking point when it comes to the health and well-being of client base. So yeah, I think absolutely I try to put the relationship first in my practice, teaching now and previously teaching, whether it was at the college level or grade school level or wherever.
Thank you.
But it's not across the board. There are still a lot of folks who cringe when there are a lot of people who cringe when I talk. But when I talk about the boundaries, there's still a strong contingent of folks that say absolutely don't go there. And I'm saying I absolutely must go there.
Well, I have a question for you. This is, I guess, foremost directed towards John, but to all of you, really. And so just a comment first, John, I really like the map at the beginning, and really showing that, the numbers, because I think I agree, like, those huge numbers can be just sort of, you don't really pay attention at first. But I'm wondering, how can we combat apathy? So people who don't, you see those numbers and I'm a pre-service teacher, so I wonder specifically with administrators, but just anyone in general. So what do y'all think about that? How can we combat people who just see it but don't necessarily care?
My tendency around a question like that is to flip it back on people and hear everyone's perspective on it. But my take is to do something. I think as simple as it sounds. The reality, I think, is that if we don't act in some way, and by simple engagement is having conversations with people can help. I do feel that the majority of the administrators and the majority of teachers and the majority of cops and the majority of the people who are working within the human service construct are doing it well-intended. And so I don't think that we have to sell too many people on the notion of it being important to address that 37.3 million people here. I think it's a matter of engagement. It's really easy to become apathetic if we don't have any attachment to those people, those people in quotes, of course. But if we don't realize our connection to the greater system, it makes it all that much more difficult. Systematically, I think we can make a commitment to other people that help us act. And I utilize a lot of action science and participatory action research models, and we utilize that with the community engagement group. And it's really about, it's almost like any support group or where you're making a public sort of commitment to do something, to act, and you have partners in this, friends or associates, colleagues, who will call you on it and say, hey, so are you actually walking the talk? You know, if you're interested in this stuff, you should look into, like Arduous and Schoen. They talk a lot about it in their construct of business, but really they're talking about espousing one thing and making sure that you're actualizing it. So I can tell you all this mean game about what a great person how much I care about people, but if I'm not acting on that, then I'm busted as a fraud. It's where some of that authenticity comes into play. We need to be authentic and real and committed. It's a complicated issue. It's complicated and multi-pronged approaches to it. Whatever works, do it.
So that goes on as far as a whole system. So you really, and I don't know that I have any answers or all of the answers, but there are things in a system that discriminate either against students of color, against girls, against gay and lesbian students, against students that are from low socioeconomic homes. So as you look at that and you go into systems, then you need to ask, school systems, you need to ask, why are we doing this? You know, is this right? Or should it be modified? And maybe there are a few different rules for certain situations.
And I would just add that as educators or people who are going in to be teachers, I think one of the skills that you probably bring with you is the ability to listen and the ability to convey your opinion, or your thoughts, or your perspective. So take advantage of that. You may be the first person to notice that maybe you should be asking a question about why a system works a certain way, and raise your voice on that. Ask questions about that, and have an open ear to the people that you're interacting with. I know it sounds really easy. Life is always harder than that, but I think just realize that you have that opportunity to be heard and take advantage of it.
I have a question I'd like to ask all of you. How many of you are teachers or going into teaching as a profession? And how many of you are going to be human service professionals, going into human services? Okay, great. Do you realize that this is one of the few times where students from a human service program can actually sit next to a student who's in the teacher ed program and talk about a common concern, poverty? And I think one of the problems in our college is that we have these separate departments when really we have so many mutual concerns. I was just wondering, I'll start with you, John, but I really would like to hear from our audience. What do you think we can contribute to each other in our understanding of these kinds of issues?
Between human services and education?
And teacher education.
Boy, I think there's a lot. I think that I hope that we will work together. It was one of my hopes. I've been at Western now for going on 4 years, and it's one of my hopes from the outset that we would absolutely be engaged together. I think, again, we need to be. And it gets back to that discussion that I said before about how bringing people together in a cross-disciplinary sort of way, similar to cross-class communication and cross-class groups. I think because we're in this together, we can come to an agreement around how to approach people, children in this case maybe, or adults for that matter, their families. But because as human service practitioners, and by human service practitioners, they might be working on any sort of organization, including incarceration, and other sort of in juvenile justice or adult court, or what have you. But if we can approach it from a collective standpoint, it's almost like that wraparound services. The teachers have the students for so much time. Human service practitioners have access to the families, and frankly, a lot of human service practitioners have a different type of access than the school. So if we can start to communicate about, well, what can you do within your rules and construct of your organization, whether it's a school, DSHS, the Opportunity Council, Interfaith Health Services, whatever the organization is, and then be able to dance together. I think that's how we can take it to that individual level. It's a long-winded answer to say, I think if we communicate, again, it goes back to that relational thing, we can do it. Imagine, to get back to your question earlier, just imagine, just within this room, the power that we have. And, it's easy for me to get on my soapbox and bring out my cheerleader pom-poms. And sometimes I feel like I need to do that. And the reality is we have so much potential in this room to make positive impact. And we don't have to wait for graduation to do it. We don't have to wait till next month to do it. We can start now, and even acknowledging what we're already doing and building off of that. And that's sort of what I would like to champion for folks, is to make that commitment and do it. And so I make a commitment with you to work together as a colleague across disciplines. Let's do it. We can talk about it all we want, but he doesn't love another meeting.
But I thought about that for a long time also, because really you can't prepare to become a teacher and see your role only in the classroom, what you're doing in the classroom. Kids are bringing their lives from their community into the classroom, and without an understanding of that, we really don't know. I think you made an interesting point, Rose, about so many of the cultural conflicts occur because we don't really understand each other and don't interpret the behavior that we see, and then kids who are different from us get channeled off into the juvenile justice system and other. Okay, we have a commitment, right? Okay. We will work towards some kind of beginning. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Right here.
So this is great in an academic environment, but outside the academic environment, it seems to me that the teacher is the central point here, that sees the child, sees the student, sees these needs, comes up against disciplinary problems, etc. And that child, in a lot of cases, is really only the canary in the coal mine to what's going on outside the school. The child encounters all these externalities outside the school. It might be racism, poverty, drugs, gangs, pimps, abusers, thieves, you name it. They're exposed to outside. They come into the school, you've got the teacher there. You don't have the DHS, you don't have juvenile, you don't have ACL, you don't have all these services and people and organizations that can help them. Those organizations are all outside the school, they're not inside the school, where that problem seems to surface. And then the teacher's got to go about trying to find or match up, if they can, if they've got time and if they're aware of what the problem is, match up that child with their problem with the appropriate people that can help them. It seems so reactive. There's nothing proactive about that. And you're talking about talking amongst disciplines here in school. Where's the facilitation of this happening out in the communities? These schools close down at 2:30, 3 o'clock, whatever, and then those buildings, those incredibly expensive buildings, are all put to rest. The lights are turned off and everybody goes to sleep. And nothing happens in those schools when so much could be happening in those schools. They could be put to use to help these students proactively instead of reactively. So, my question, I guess, is who is responsible for this? Who's the czar for the children to help the damn children out? Who's bringing all these services together so they can react proactively instead of reacting to all these problems? Who does that? And why isn't it done if it isn't done? It seems like it's not.
I just think as a high school counselor, and I worked in middle school a little bit too, that they were usually sent to the counselor to fix, and it's really hard. So I, we did a lot of work with the SHS, but what would happen, and what happens in schools is often that if you didn't have a relationship with social services or some other group, not much could happen. And even kids, when we know that they would come to school and we're in a really threatening environment at home, you call the SHS, they might come in and talk to the kid, and then they tell you, well, we can't do anything because you have to have so many referrals before we can do something, or we have to have so much, or if they start to talk to the kid would clam up. And then, so how do you break the cycle is probably the ongoing question. So the different approaches of trying to listen and work it out. I don't know that I have a total answer. There have been a variety of things that have been tried in different ways, but you really hit it on the head from my perspective of what is the correct system. And as the time has gone on, remember I said I actually went and picked that girl up. If I did that today and something happened, then I would have been really in trouble. At that point, because everybody in the school and principals knew, I probably wasn't going to get in any trouble. So there are things that even hold educators' hands now that are sometimes intended to protect kids. Like the whole safety issue about one teacher being with a student in their private car is not a thing you should do. It seems like the more we get for protection too, the more hand-tied we are. So I don't know if you have any suggestions.
I was just going to say, I don't know that I have a complete answer to your question, but some thoughts on it. One are, as an educator, obviously your primary job is educating, and you have more than one student in your class, so you're limited. But I will say, part of my talk was about the flaws in our current truancy system in the state. But there's part of it, and part of the initial intent, that makes some sense, that tries to pull together the questions you're asking, which says, we think that when a student starts missing school, that's potentially a sign that there's something going on other than the kid just doesn't want to go to school. So in theory, under our truancy laws, when a student starts missing school, it starts a series of dialogues between a school and a family to figure out what's going on. Now, I think the important thing is, and I know a lot of this is focused on human services, so you are looking at the context outside of the school. The important thing is, don't forget to look at what you are doing inside the school and how that affects the student. Whatever they come in with, when they get there, they should get equal opportunity. If that means that the student or their family is not an English proficient speaking student or family, they should get communication in the language that they speak fluently. I don't know any family that can pick up the phone and have a good conversation with a principal about what's going on with their student when the family speaks one language and the principal speaks another and there's not a translator available. So you have to make those steps. You have to make sure that when the student comes in, if they are from a minority community, that they're not facing harassment on a daily basis that wears them down and makes them uninterested in the academics. So you have to make sure that the school environment is doing its job to provide the education that the student is entitled to, which is an equitable education. But then there are these systems that are intended to be set up so that because there are what we call warnings or flags that trigger, hey, maybe this student needs some help, that those are the kind of systems that we want to make sure they're working appropriately. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have some system in place so that when a student starts missing school, someone says, wait, stop, what's going on? Let's have some consequences, let's have some dialogue. But that dialogue should be more about school-based, connecting with the services that are appropriate rather than immediately moving towards a punishment or a coercion model. So I think as an educator, you look to understand where those points are. And I think the school discipline system is one of those points where you should stop and ask, why is this kid misbehaving? And there's an effort, I think, around the nation. It's called the Positive Behavior Intervention Support System. There's been laws proposed. I think now President Obama had been behind one of them. Anyway, there's just this dialogue about changing school discipline from a punishment model to education and as a trigger point to say what's going on with the student. Are there services that they need that they're not getting in the school system, or there are issues that they're taking with them from outside into the context? So it may not be ideal because you have to get a number of players involved, but there are things that are set up that are trying to trigger us to ask the questions and to call the people that we know have the expertise in the area that someone needs help in.
Real quickly, because I know people are wanting to go home and write reports and things. I think there are several success stories out there, and so I think we can look at different programs that are happening. It depends on you opened up a can with all sorts of issues in it. One around the building and facility use. If you want to look up the lighted schoolhouse efforts that were happening in Boston over the last 15 years or so, there's a really good example of what can happen when the school systems, the court systems, and the human service players all come together and actually get the school facilities open and utilize them. You can think about, in terms of the same issue about the relationships, about the worker and client or teacher and student, is also true about teacher and colleague who might be outside of the school walls. So while I know that it's a lot of work for both human service practitioner who's outside of the school and for the school teacher or administrator to take that effort to connect with the community members, so that as a teacher you have a short list of where you can send the children who are going to your district, because you have a pretty good idea of the geographic location of where they live. So if you can send them to places like Northwest Youth Services to get particular services, or recommend them to everything from clubs to counseling, and get to know, once you know the kids and you have a relationship with those community players, it's really easy for you to call them up and say, hey John, I have this kid who is really needing some help in the afternoons. And that kind of that's a part of the connection that I'm referring to. It's not only the connection with the direct client or student, but collegial contacts around the community, so that if we're not working together, it's really difficult to not let people fall through the cracks. These cracks just get bigger. There's a lot of places that I'd be happy to direct you to in terms of the youth work element, where some services could be drummed up.
One of the things that struck me in the case you were talking about, because this is an ELL student, there is a law called it was called the Bully Bill, and it's harassment, and to give false accusations against someone is not allowable. Now, under most school district policy, as far as discipline goes, the person who has been accused has the right to face the accuser. Now, under the bully law, when we drafted the model bully policy, we put in there that under those circumstances they don't have to face the accused. The victim doesn't have to face the bully. But so I would be interested to know, since this was an ELL student and they didn't have any evidence, then was this a false claim? And if it was, then it puts it under the bully laws. And so I think when you start having things like that going on, and several of the other things you kind of described to me, is this harassment or is it bullying? And if it is, you have policies that cover all kinds of bullying in your school districts. So one of the reasons that kids often stop coming to school or late to class, hang out in the library, whatever it is because they're being harassed and bullied because their clothes aren't nice, they don't speak the language, they look different, whatever the reason is. So I just throw that out because that was what I thought whenever you said that and they didn't have any proof. Well, to me that's just probably bullying, unless they have the ability to do that. So.
Well, we have reached our time limit, and I'd like to ask you to think about this as just the beginning there's so much more now that we can explore in our classes and together. And please join me in thanking our panelists.